The year was 1305, and London stirred with its usual chaos, horses clattering across cobblestones, merchants shouting over salted fish and ale, smoke curling from 1,000 hearths. Yet that August morning carried a darker anticipation. Crowds gathered not for festival or trade, but to witness the death of a man who had come to symbolize the fury of a nation, William Wallace. Wallace was no ordinary rebel. To Edward I, known as Longshanks, he embodied defiance itself. He had risen from obscurity, not as a noble chasing power, but as a minor landowner driven by outrage at English occupation. In 1297, Wallace struck with ferocity at Stirling Bridge, shattering the myth of English invincibility. For one glorious moment, the Scottish people glimpsed the possibility of freedom. But England was relentless. Edward had crushed Wales and expelled the Jews of England with merciless efficiency. Rebellion, to him, was fire. It must be stamped out completely, or it would consume the realm. Wallace's victory at Stirling had to be erased, not just militarily, but symbolically. Edward would not be satisfied until Wallace's name itself was blackened, his body destroyed, and his memory turned into a weapon of fear. By 1305, Wallace was isolated. Many Scottish nobles had bent the knee, preferring compromise to annihilation. Wallace's defiance shamed them, and his very survival threatened the fragile peace they had struck with Edward. His capture became both a political necessity and a personal obsession for the king. The betrayal came, as it so often does, from within. Near Glasgow, Wallace was seized, likely through the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English power. The details remain debated, but the outcome was not. Wallace, the symbol of resistance, was bound in chains and paraded south. His fall was celebrated across England. Yet for Edward, his capture was only the prelude to something far more chilling. Wallace would not be granted a soldier's death. He would be unmade. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a calculated torment. Wallace, shackled and bound, was dragged through English towns as though already condemned. Crowds jeered, spit, and hurled refuse. To the English crown, this was not merely transport, it was theatre. Every village that glimpsed the rebel knight was reminded of Edward's absolute reach. Every insult hurled at Wallace chipped away at his legend. By the time he reached London, Wallace had already been paraded as a trophy. But the true performance had only just begun. On August 23rd, 1305, he was brought before Westminster Hall, the grandest court in the kingdom. The trial was a farce, scripted from start to finish. Proceedings were conducted in Latin, a tongue Wallace likely did not understand. He was charged with treason, murder, arson, and sacrilege. The irony was sharp. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. His response was defiant. He declared he could not be guilty of treason against a king who was never his sovereign. His words carried courage, but his fate was sealed long before he spoke them. The sentence was pronounced with ritual solemnity. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal punishment in medieval England, reserved for traitors. Each stage of the execution was laced with symbolism. To be drawn on a wooden hurdle meant degradation. To be hanged but cut down alive was rejection by heaven. To be disemboweled alive symbolized spiritual corruption. To be quartered was obliteration itself. Wallace was to be annihilated, not just in flesh, but in memory, broken into pieces scattered across the realm. London prepared with grim enthusiasm. The authorities turned the day into a spectacle. Scaffolds were raised, vendors stocked pies and ale, families traveled miles for a glimpse of the carnage. This was to be no quiet execution. It was a carnival of cruelty. Morning broke warm and clear. Wallace, stripped and bound to a wooden frame, was dragged through the busiest streets of London. The route was chosen carefully to maximize humiliation. From the Tower to Smithfield, every step was meant to grind his body against cobblestones, tearing his flesh, marking the ground with his blood. The crowds roared with a mix of hatred, curiosity, and morbid glee. Medieval executions were public theatre, and Wallace's was to be the grandest of them all. Children perched on rooftops, vendors shouted over the noise, and soldiers forced the throng back to keep the path clear. Some jeered and spat, others watched silently, uneasy with the cruelty unfolding. Yet all were participants in Edward's orchestrated drama. Contemporary accounts describe Wallace's silence. He did not beg, he did not cry out. His gaze, fixed ahead, unnerved those close enough to see. Was it defiance, resignation, or something more, a vision beyond the horror? Whatever it was, his composure only deepened his legend. At Smithfield, the great execution ground, the final act began. Wallace was hanged by the neck, but not until death. He dangled, gasping, face darkening, body convulsing. Before the end came, the rope was cut. He was lowered, still alive, to the scaffold, where the true horror awaited. The executioner, skilled in cruelty, began his work. Wallace's abdomen was cut open. Organs were pulled out one by one and tossed into a fire, the smoke of burning flesh drifting over the crowd. In medieval belief, the bowels were the seat of compassion. Burning them symbolized the destruction of humanity itself. Witnesses later wrote that his cries pierced the air, unlike any sound they had ever heard. Others swore he did not scream at all, that he endured with silent fury. Either way, his torment seared itself into memory. Finally, his head was struck from his shoulders. The executioner held it aloft, crimson dripping, as the crowd erupted. But the desecration was not complete. His body was quartered, each limb hacked away and displayed to the masses like trophies. His head was dipped in tar and fixed upon London Bridge, staring blankly across the Thames. His quarters were dispatched to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, grim messages to Scotland that rebellion ended in ruin. This was more than punishment. It was performance, a calculated ritual of terror. Edward had turned justice into theatre, ensuring Wallace's death would echo for centuries. Edward achieved his goal in the immediate sense. Wallace was dead, destroyed utterly. His body scattered, his name smeared with accusations of treason and sacrilege. For many Scots, fear was real. Rebellion flickered, nobles submitted, and the English crown tightened its grip. Yet Edward miscalculated. Instead of erasing Wallace, he transformed him into legend. Songs and stories turned his agony into martyrdom. In villages across Scotland, families whispered of his courage, not his defeat. For those who still dreamed of freedom, Wallace's death was not deterrence, it was inspiration. Robert the Bruce, who would later lead Scotland to independence, was said to have been stirred by the spectacle of Wallace's execution. What Edward meant as a warning became a rallying cry. The message was clear. The English crown offered no mercy. Better to die on the field than to live under the yoke. Abroad, too, the cruelty shocked observers. In European courts, whispers spread that England had not destroyed a rebel, but created a martyr. Wallace's name became synonymous not with treason, but with the price of liberty. Centuries later, the memory endures. From medieval ballads to modern films, Wallace's story has been retold again and again. His execution, in all its brutality, remains a reminder that freedom often demands sacrifice, and that the attempt to silence an idea can give it greater voice. On that day in 1305, Wallace's body was scattered across Britain, but his spirit was scattered wider still, into every age where tyranny rises and freedom fights back. His blood stained London's cobblestones, but his defiance carved itself into Scotland's heart. In death, William Wallace became immortal.